Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the San Francisco Library and to our fabulous Litquake Literary Festival. I'm John Smalley, a librarian with the Humanities Center here in the main library. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our community and to tell you about a couple upcoming events. On behalf of the public library, we wish to welcome you to the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as caretakers of this place. As guests, we who reside in their traditional territory recognize that we benefit from living and working on their homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. And speaking of the Ramaytush community, the main library has just unveiled a mural called Atama to Listen, and you can see this when you are back on the first floor. If you're standing in the atrium, look at the staircase that goes from the main floor to the second floor, and you will see this beautiful new mural. Also, I want to mention on Sunday, November 16th, 1 p.m., we will have in this very room a celebration of the poetry of the poet and scholar, Native American poet and scholar, Janice Gould. So now a few words about Litquake. Litquake this year features 150 programs, including 500 presenters, and the library is proud to have at least 5 programs in this year's lineup. Litquake relies heavily on donors, people like you. Although that said, tonight's program and every program in the library and 80% of Litquake's programs are absolutely free. Litquake does aim to build a community and a sense of belonging around the written word. So if you share those values, consider supporting Litquake. There is a QR code at the back of your program booklet. I'll say there's also, if you're interested about more programs here in the library or in Litquake, the Litquake program booklets are on the table on your right-hand side. Also, there's the library newsletter and various flyers for upcoming events, as well as coffee and cookies. So help yourself to that. You can also learn about our programs on our online calendar, our website, sfpl.org. Please do also consider supporting our authors. So books by both of tonight's authors are for sale at the table in the back of the room. And the just published Elegies of the Earth, if you purchase your copy tonight, you will be the very first people in this country to have a copy. They were just flown in from Germany yesterday. So consider buying copies of that and also of Matthew Zapruder's book. I think I'd like to extend some thanks to people that supported this year's Litquake 2025. Among the major supporters are Lisa Brown and Daniel Handler, also the Hawthornden Foundation, the William R. Hearst III Foundation, Minor Anderson Foundation, as well as SF Grants for the Arts. So thank you to those folks. I'd also like to thank some of the media involved this year, including KQAD, KLW, KEXP, Mission Local News, 48 Hills, SF Arts, Cityscape, Johnny Fun Cheap, 7x7, Substrate, and Publishers Weekly. So thank you to our media sponsors as well. And as usual, big thanks to friends of the San Francisco Public Library who support our programs all year round. Maybe one last thing I want to mention, we have surveys. Do you see those surveys and pencils on your seats? They were there when you arrived. Please do fill those out. The information is anonymous, and that information that you give us will help Litquake apply for grants next year. So that's a big help to them and to us. That's about it for my introductory comments. I now just want to say a few words about tonight's presenters. So Niloufar Talebi is an author, translator, and Fulbright scholar. Her portrait in bloom is a literary portrait of the poet Ahmad Shamlou. Her Abraham in Flames, which she co-created, is an opera based on the poet's legacy. Tonight's book, Elegies of the Earth, celebrates the centenary of the poet, and it features Niloufar's translations. She has received commissions from Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, Stanford Live, and she currently teaches at Stanford's continuing education. Matthew Zapruder is the author of 6 books of poetry, including what are they? I Love Hearing Your Dreams and Father's Day. There's also a book of translations, Secret Weapons, and this is translations of the late poetry by the Romanian poet Eugen Gelebenu, sorry. And he has also written books, Why Poetry and Story of a Poem. He's the former poetry editor of the New York Times Magazine, as well as editor of the Best of American Poetry 2022. He's currently editor-at-large for Wave Books and teaches in the MFA program at St. Mary's in Moraga, St. Mary's College in Moraga. So please give a warm welcome to our presenters.
Thank you to you all for being here. Thank you to the library. Thank you, John. Thank you to the booksellers. And first, before I say anything else, I just want to congratulate Niloufar on this extraordinary book, Inside and Out. Congratulations, and it's an honor to be here to, really at the inception of its physical reality in the world. And I'm sure it will go on to do many great things and have many grateful readers. And we're going to talk a lot about what's in this book. I do want to say, first of all, it means a lot to be in this room tonight, where our city is going through something really tough right now, and I know a lot of people are scared and upset, and and worried, and I just want to extend, I want to acknowledge that and just say that let's stick together and not forget what it is we're trying to protect, which is things like what are in this book. With that in mind, we'll go on to talk about poetry. Just very briefly, I think we're going to hear the voice of Shamlou. Is that right? To start, is that how we'll get started? Yeah.
Pretty soon, yes.
Yeah, pretty soon. Yeah,
yes.
Soon. No, not soon enough, I'm sure. But just before we get started, I just want to say I was very honored to be asked to do this event. I'm either the worst possible or the best possible choice because I knew nothing about Shamlou before I was asked, and then which is strange because my generation of poets actually is very influenced by poetry and translation. It's extremely important to us, and we consider it a vital part of our poetic education. And the poets from Transtromer to Szymborska to Lorca, of course, to so many others are so central to our poetic lives, and it's astonishing that we just did not know anything about this really central figure, actually, whose work is, reading this book, I thought, my God, it would have been so wonderful to have these poems when I was earlier in my life. I'm glad to have them now, of course. So anyway, I'm a good foil tonight, and I hope also you'll all feel comfortable about asking questions and after we talk for a bit. So yeah, maybe we should just jump in and start by hearing Shamlou's voice, unless there's something you want to add before we get started.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew. I'm delighted that you're here. I really thought that you would be the perfect person to introduce Shamlou, help me introduce Shamlou and this book, simply because of your own poetry and your own dedication to literature and literature in translation, and literature as a transformative power, which is what Shamlou was all about. And before all that, I would like to thank, I have a long list of people to thank, but in this room, I'd love to thank John Smalley and his team at the San Francisco Public Library. I have a very long-standing relationship with this library that goes about 30 years, and it's my beloved institution. I also would like to thank Litquake for continuing to present the work that I do and the work that all of us literary artists do in this city and beyond now. And I also want to thank people that I've mentioned in the acknowledgements. I'm sure you can read their names yourselves, but people on whose shoulders I stand, people who helped me for over a decade to understand and read through Shamlou's poetry, which is extremely dense and intellectual and revolutionary. And he was a wordsmith and he bent language in so many ways. So it was very difficult to get through it on my own. So I have to thank all those friend slash teachers who did that for me. And then as the poetry was making its way from its land through other lands and across the ocean and to our land here, from one language and culture to this one, from the source to the target, which is for you. I had many other helpers who helped me with suggestions on the translation, editing. You know, this was a 13-year process for me. I first met Ahmad Shamlou when I was 12 years old, when he started coming to our home, my parents' home, as a central figure in their secret literary salons after the 1979 revolution. So I knew him for 4 years. Those were formative years for me between the ages 11, 12, and 15, 16, when I immigrated again and we came to the West. But he remained a figure for me. And then I had a few extraordinary encounters with him when he came in 1990 and 1991 for a USA and world tour to speak. And I joined him on the road as he spoke at UCLA and UC Berkeley. And he did a very, very controversial talk at UC Berkeley, which we may or may not get into in this 1 hour or so. But I was there in that room when he made those allegations against one of the Iranian classical poets, which made him a little bit of a more controversial figure. But before anything, I would love I have brought a few audio files and a video file for you to just see Shamlou. We can see his picture here. And I also brought you the original compendium that I used. This is almost all of his work in this book. He has a lot of notes in there himself as well. And this is a little bit over 400 poems, depending on how you count the poems. And so this is what became my companion for the last many, 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 many years. And it was whittled down to 80 of what I think are the essential poems of Shamlou that would appear well and will be received well into the English language. And this is a bilingual edition. But he was very, very charismatic, and he also had an incredibly beautiful voice, and he recited many of his poems, and he left those behind for us as a gift. So we are going to hear a poem called Ishq Umumi, which means universal love or collective love or common love. You can see from those three options that I just put out there, the terror of a translator having to pick one for publication. But so I've picked one for here. So you'll hear that, and then I'll read you the English so we can enter into his work and his legacy through his poetry, which is just what he wanted. He's famously wrote as the epigraph of this book that my biography is just my poetry and nothing else. So we should just delve into the poetry as soon as possible. So we'll start with Common Love, Ishq Umumi.
اشک رازی است، لبخند رازی است، عشق رازی است. اشک آن شب لبخند عشقم بود. قصه نیستم که بگویی، نغمه نیستم که بخوانی، صدا نیستم که بشنوی، یا چیزی چنان که ببینی، یا چیزی چنان که بدانی. من درد مشترکم مرا فریاد کن. درخت با جنگل سخن میگوید، علف با صحرا، ستاره با کهکشان، و من با تو سخن میگویم. نامت را به من بگو، دستت را به من بده، حرفت را به من بگو، قلبت را به من بده. من ریشه های تو را دریافتم، با لبانت برای همه لبها سخن گفتم، و دستهایت با دستان من آشناست. در خلوت روشن با تو گریستم برای خاطر زندگان، و در گورستان تاریک با تو خوانده‌ام زیباترین سرودها را، زیرا که مردگان این سال عاشق‌ترین زندگان بودند. دستت را به من بده، دستهای تو با من آشناست. ای دیر یافته با تو سخن میگویم، بسان ابر که با طوفان، بسان علف که با صحرا، بسان باران که با دریا، بسان پرنده که با بهار، بسان درخت که با جنگل سخن میگوید. زیرا که من ریشه های تو را دریافتم، زیرا که صدای من با صدای تو آشناست.
Common love. Tears are a mystery, smiles a mystery, love a mystery. The tears of that night were the smile of my love. I am not a tale to be told, not a song to be sung, not a sound to be heard, nor something you can see or something you can know. I am common pain, cry me out. The tree speaks with the woods, the weed with the field, the star with the galaxy, and I speak with you. Tell me your name, give me your hand, tell me your words, give me your heart. I have discovered your depths and spoken for all through your lips, and your hands are familiar with mine. I have wept in blazing solitude with you for the sake of the living, and sung with you in the darkest of graveyards the most beautiful of songs, because the dead of this year were the most loving of the living. Give me your hand, your hands know me. Oh, you found at last. I speak with you as the cloud with the storm, the weed with the field, the rain with the sea, the bird with the spring, and the tree that speaks with the woods. For I have discovered your depths, for my voice is intimate with yours.
Wow.
It's a 1955 poem. Shamlou was born in 1925, which makes this his centennial year. And I've been working towards this volume for many, many years so we can mark this special occasion. He died in the year 2000. So this year also marks the 25th anniversary of his death. December 12th is his birthday, so that's his actual centennial. So he wrote this poem in 1955. In that year, there were many freedom fighters and people, political activists who were murdered by one of the many organizations that were fighting against people fighting for freedom in Iran. And so he wrote this, the dead of this year is who he was referring to, in observance of those killings. Many of his poems are dedicated actually to various freedom fighters who fought for freedom and gave up so much of their lives and died young fighting for freedom. He himself was a freedom fighter, not only by the use of his pen, but by being a beacon of hope to the people. His greatest strength was that he took high art and the street language, so-called the low arts, and he fused them together so that he could both satisfy and foment a literary revolution, but also be the spokesperson and capture the spirit of the century and the spirit of people who are and were looking for freedom all over the world, not just Iran. He has poems for a lot of different people, specifically dedicated to them. But that's why the theme of tonight, which is poetry as resistance, yes, I think he is of the ilk of poets who was solely dedicated to fighting for, making art for, illuminating and enlightening people for freedom, for the pursuit of freedom and those who were in the pursuit of freedom against all tyranny. So he would be an appropriate poet to speak about today in this city where we are now being invaded by, in this city, by forces of, what should we call them? Mercenaries who are brothers killing and torturing brothers. Yeah.
Yeah, it's immediately clear when reading his work that he's a world poet. He's a world figure. He's one of those poets like Nazim Hikmet, who and many others whose work seems to speak across time and across cultures. Obviously, the other side of that is that of course it's important to understand as best one can the cultural context of these poems and where they come from in the language. So I don't want to move over that, but I do want to just say that in response to what you just said, that there's something just immediately present about his voice. Virginia Woolf has this famous quote, "The poet is always our contemporary," and I feel like these poems could have been written tomorrow. But anyways, before we, to get started, and also I just want to say what an amazing reading. I mean, my God, it's like I felt like maybe we should just sit here and listen to him read for the next hour. Maybe what we could just start with is by, this volume is beautiful and it has a lovely, appropriately sized biography of him in the back and some information from you. But what do you think we should know as readers who might not know about him? Other than the facts of his life, like what sorts of things might be helpful for us to know when we enter into reading his poems or listening?
That's a great question. So in the back, we have a lot of notes. I start all of my projects because I don't know anything about it. And so the project becomes the process of my researching the thing. So I had to do these notes for you because I had to do them for me. And I didn't want you to be deprived of them. So I have a lot of notes in the back, and I've written a previous book, Self-Portrait in Bloom, which is my own memoir, but it's woven with his literary biography and how my intersection with him shaped and defined my life. And I went on to create several other projects, namely an opera, which John mentioned, Abraham in Flames, which is named after a 1973 volume of Shamlou's poems. He has 18 volumes of poetry and many, many, many other books. He was a very prolific translator through intermediaries and third languages of world literature. So I think perhaps the reason why we can experience Shamlou as a world poet is because he did ingest world poetry, and he sort of transferred all of those aesthetic ideas and all of those metaphors and images, and he grafted them to the metaphors and images that are part of traditional and iconic and archaic Persian poetry and Persian poetics, as he was continuing the work of his predecessor, the poet Nima Yushij, who had dared in isolation to break with the rhyming and formal features of what we know as classical Persian poetry. We know Rumi, we know Hafez, and we revere these poets, and they've been translated into many languages in the West, starting with the 18th century translations. So Shamlou's predecessor, Nima, started breaking those rhyming schemes. And of course, he was ostracized by traditionalists. So he sort of had to do this in isolation and stay home. So when Shamlou, who was uneducated, he never finished school because he was born into a middle-level military family. His father was a mid-level military person, and he was basically taken. He followed, basically went from small town to small town to small town. And so he had no continuity in his education, and he had no encouragement or inspiration in his educational years, no inspiration at all at home, and he basically just left school. He originally went through a little bit of a political phase where he thought that perhaps his expression of, remember this was in, so if he was born in 1925, he was a young person during World War II when the Russians and the British were exploiting neutral Iran. Iran was neutral, but Iran was being exploited, and the Russians and the British were coming in and creating routes in order to starve Iranians to death, but take that food over up north to Russian soldiers. So this was the beginning of his political activity. Well, he decided that, you know, the sword wasn't really his thing, and he started to study literature. He started to write, and then he discovered Nima. He heard about Nima's work, and the legend is that he went over, he found where Nima lives, and he knocked on his door, and he said, you're going to be my mentor. And he sort of followed, that's his transitional period, 1940s to 1950s. He sort of continued, he studied with and continued Nima's work, but famously in 1949, when he had promised in one of his many, many literary magazines that he either started or shuttered, because his work was always so controversial, that when the manuscript that Nima had promised arrived, Shamlou, young Shamlou, didn't think that it had delivered the radical innovations in poetry that Nima should have delivered, and he let the magazine shutter so he wouldn't have to publish that poem. And so he considers that day in February of 1949 his birth, because that's when he, as the radical innovator who pushed things even more forward and took that, breaking just with rhyming schemes, all the way to free verse over the few decades that he worked. So that's the kind of revolutionary and daring person that he was. So that's who he was. And then I don't remember the rest of your question, Matthew.
No, I was just sort of about what kinds of things might be helpful for us when we start to read these poems beyond his biography, but I think you answered it
Oh,
very well.
I think what I wanted to say with that introduction was that his influence was world poetry. So he was ingesting everything from all over the world. He was translating it. And then he was, again, bringing that in and mixing it up with the demands of a new century, 20th century, country in upheaval, World War II, and then, you know, the coup d'etat, the 1953 coup d'etat, you know, brought on by MI6, the British, and it was called Operation Ajax here, the CIA, and these are published now, these papers. So that was a traumatic event in history, and Shamlou was imprisoned many times himself. His friends were imprisoned. He has many poems, you know, that he wrote about his friends who were freedom fighters, and he watched executions, and it was an incredibly tumultuous century, and it continues to be.
And he
So
himself was in prison, of course, too.
he was in prison, yes, exactly. So yes, he has a very famous letter that he wrote to his father. It's a very long poem, and it's the only one that's written in formal poetry. It's in a qasida form, and I shrunk it down and made it into a new poem. It's the only one where I did that for you, because I didn't want to have to translate all of it. It was in formal structure. It was very long, but I have extracted the gist of it for you into a much shorter poem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you said a few times that you know, his work formally was a reaction against and the strictures of formal verse and rhyme and Persian in classical Persian poetry. So that's something I think that we can kind of understand from our own literary context. We have similar analogies, right? We can think of poets who did the same thing, rejected these sort of more formal strictures. A lot of the writing about Shamlou talks about his innovation in the image, particularly that he took, and you actually mentioned this earlier in your remarks, that he took images that are sort of familiar from classical or traditional like Persian poetry, and he sort of renewed them or changed them, and also added imagery that was more contemporary or more from everyday life. Is there an example of a poem? I'm putting you on the spot a bit. Is there, or can we just talk about that a bit? Because I mean, I guess selfishly also very interested in that, because that's also a kind of, that's a story that we've heard many times in different the greatest poets have done that. They've both looked in the past and they've taken things forward and they've changed it and they've innovated. So I'm just interested and curious to hear more about that.
Well, I think his greatest strength in the fact, let me rephrase that. I think the reason why Shamlou would do well in English and in Western translation is that he actually used components from the Western canon a lot in his poetry. So in translation, that's something that's really familiar. Now, there's a lot of other historical and social context that I had to somehow figure out how to bring to you without creating a 1,000-page book like the original, and having annotations and footnotes so that it's really not, that wouldn't be as accessible to you. So I always had to negotiate how to balance the fact that, okay, well, he's making a lot of references to Abel and Cain, and everybody knows Abel and Cain here in the West, but there's a lot of other, like, for example, if I hadn't told us the footnote about who the dead of this year are, that poem still makes sense. But it's nice to know the context of what he's actually referring to. So I, as a translator and editor, had to constantly make that negotiation for you, the reader. I wonder whether you would enjoy just a short, he has 5 or 6 poems that are sort of longer, and they're exactly like biblical verse. They are biblical verse, but they are his version of the story. And not just specific stories, but his version of how religion and the institutionalization of religion ruined humanity, and that humanity did it to themselves. People did it to themselves. He also has a wonderful one, which I translated the title to as Genesis, and that's really, really, I think it's the most erotic poem I've ever read, and it's his retelling of Adam and Eve. It's his retelling of how humanity was born. And I wonder whether I should read that, or would you like Genesis, or would you like Reasons for Silence?
I mean, this crowd isn't going to turn down an erotic poem. Why that's what it is? Come on.
It's an
You
erotic
really
poem to
teased
me.
everybody with that one. You're like, yeah, it's like, no, we'd rather have the other one. No, come on. Yeah, let's go with the erotic poem.
Okay. So it's a little bit like prose, it's in blocks, kind of like, a biblical verse. And there's a lot of repetition, and it's slightly over 1 page. So Genesis. There was the faint breath of wind and the thin silk of moonlight and fountain and garden. And it was on the 4th midnight when the new bride landed from home in the moon-struck garden, wandering, pondering the new heat coursing through her breast's blue veins, itself like the earth's burning fever that feeds unripe lemons. And there was in her eyes that watched the moonlight and flora shame from the newly awakened lust burning in her loins, unquenchable like the ever insatiable thirst of grass that feeds the meadow's greenness. And she was ashamed of an elusive, faltering, and fleeting memory of what befell her body between her, alien to the event, and a fierce alien man, swift and wise with the ways of her body, sweeping so covetous a hand on her sleeping body, moving as a breeze charged with the scent of sun-soaked grass that peels away the blossom sheaths to reveal the unripe seed. There was the faint breath of wind and the thin silk of moonlight and the garden's fountain that danced in the little pond with its swaying lithe arms. And on the 4th midnight, the new bride slumbered on this stretch of grass. And in the same breath, I was in the newly sprouted leaves, or in the fluttering breeze, and perhaps if even in the deep waters and the breath of the wind stirring little blossoms on the thick tree wailed in me, and bright streams of rain wept in me. There was the faint breath of wind and the thin silk of moonlight, and the garden's fountain, and on the fourth midnight the new bride, sleeping on the bed of newly sprouted grass, with fire in her core, trembled onto herself from sensing a man beside her. And I was neither leaf nor lake, neither wind nor rain. Oh, you plant spirit, my body was your prison house, and the new bride was inseminated by the spirit of tree and wind and water before sensing my father's lips upon hers on the fourth midnight. And I turned a leafless and windless city into my prison house, without the memory of wind and leaf ever escaping me. My eyes were like two elm leaves when I was born, my veins like water lily vine, my hands maple claws, my spirit fleeting like wind and water like rain, and a life-sucking pain like the cry of death burst in me as the old elm fell to the land by the thunder's wrath. And I, oh pain-ridden nature, oh Father, I was your child.
That poem is crazy because I mean it's amazing because like it's this one thing. I mean it's amazing. It's an amazing poem. It's like it's shocking though because like in the middle of that story, it just like the eye appears. What is that? I mean that's amazing. Like it seems like it's going to be about this one thing, and then suddenly this consciousness of the speaker appears in the like manifested in the natural world, kind of like almost like their spirit is in the landscape. Like what do you make of this poem?
I think, and if you read his other poems, there's always a tension between human and the divine. There's always that tension. And knowing him, you know, he was against the monolithic idea that we are born of this monolithic God, and that first we are, you know, this bride, this Eve that's in the garden, she is inseminated by nature. It's this elusive sort of ghost of a male force somehow that rapes her, really, that forces itself into her sort of by osmosis. And then the consciousness is born. The consciousness is humanity. And that humanity, it's almost like the saying that we have here in English, which is we are spiritual beings having a material experience. Is that the saying, right? It's the same thing, that this spiritual narrator is brought down to earth and inseminated through Eve and born through Eve, and its limitlessness is then bound by body. And that's his version of how we come to be.
I mean, it's mythic, it's psychological, it's obviously also religious. It feels allegorical. I get the feeling that this like I get the feels a lot with his poems where I can get a lot from it, but also there's a lot more to be learned once you probably know more of the context or more of the read the notes or start to understand. So you can have an immediate experience with the poems. And then also there's more work to be done. That's good work, I think, of a reader.
What else would you need to know about that? I didn't write any notes
Oh no,
about this
no,
one
not
that
that I
I
need to.
can think of.
No, not that I necessarily need to know anything. It's just that I get the feeling that there's well when I read something like, for instance, and I wanted to ask you, I want to make sure we talk about your work as a translator, because I'm interested in actually how you make your way through a poem like this, because extremely challenging. I know from experience. But for instance, when he says, "And I turned a leafless and windless city into my prison house without the memory of wind and leaf ever escaping me," I get the feeling that that's a line that functions in this poem, but also that it maybe might call to mind other things for readers who were, you know, there, or for himself. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but it makes me want to go find out, I guess.
Did it conjure anything for you?
Well, the word, the prison house, the idea of the prison house, and sort of the idea of you yourself making your own prison feels to me a little bit like something that would be that might very well have a you know, a cultural or political kind of refraction. I don't know, or it could be a psychological one, a personal one. I'm not sure.
I don't know if this one necessarily had a political connotation, but it does have, in a country that's besieged by, you know, religious forces. This was an early poem, so this is before the revolution. This is written in 1960, when there were still, you know, the monarchy and the religious, you know, figures hadn't taken over yet. It would be another 20 years until they did. But I think, in a way, it's his humanism that's at work here, which is to say that, you know, later on when he writes more of these biblical verses, it's always about the divine forces or the earth actually accusing man or humanity of enslaving itself. Why did you, I gave you everything and then you had to go and squander it and make it a sacrifice to some monolithic idol that you create, and then you go begging with your hands on your chest for the very things that were free for you that I gave for you. Why would you do that?
Right.
Sort of thing.
It's a good question.
So
Yeah. No, it's so before, I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I definitely want to also leave some space for the audience to ask questions too. But that line I read, and the whole end passage, by the way, is so gorgeous, and it's beautifully translated.
this
It
was a
really,
hard one to
I
translate.
bet it was. So that's what I was going to ask you about. Can you just talk about the experience of translating this poem as you know, as a window into the, I mean, you lived with these poems since 2012, this project, you probably picked up this book, but I'm sure you had some idea of what you were getting into, but probably,
No, I didn't.
yeah.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I, of course, knew by proximity to him, so at such an early age, of what a, you know, monumental Nobel Prize nominated, massive cultural figure, to the point where we were never allowed to say that he was at our house in those early years of the revolution. It was chaos. Who knew what was happening? The Revolutionary Guard, you know, they were invading any home they wanted. They stopping anybody. I was pushed into one of their cars twice as a teenager. So of course we could never say, but at the same time, he was never touched by that regime after the revolution. He was such a huge figure. And one of the things that I was really sad about, and I actually start the introduction about, to him with, is that, you know, when he died in the year 2000, his tombstone is a very humble tombstone on the aisle of a cemetery of a plot with identical tombstones. And I just think, would this happen to, you know, in many other countries, to one of their greatest poets, among all of their poets, one of their greatest poets? No, there would be monuments and all of that. So it hurts me to the core that there's just a very sort of almost just common grave, but perhaps it's just perfect for him because he was a people's poet, you know, while at the same time being at the highest literary levels and a world-class poet. So, you know,
Well, maybe if there
yeah.
were more, if there were a big monument and everybody already knew, then maybe it wouldn't have been felt so urgent to you to do this work. So
Oh, for me as a
we might
translator,
be the
yeah.
beneficiaries of that in a way, is that, you know, that your urgency to do this work and your commitment, obvious commitment to it, comes from a sense that you are, you know, you need to continue and preserve his legacy.
Yeah, because no one knew him. That's why. When I came to this country and I would say I'm from such and such country, you know, if we were talking about poetry, it was always Rumi, And I kept saying there are more poets in Iran than Rumi. And then I started to translate by accident 22 years ago, 21, 22 years ago. And I always knew that once I worked enough that I would get to this book, get to understand this book. And of course, I had to study for years to understand the poems. And I've lived with them for many years. And then translating them was, we can call people right now and get them on speakerphone to say how many times I called and I meltdown after meltdown after meltdown, screaming and yelling about why am I doing this? Why are you helping me? Why don't I understand this? And that's just from me to the Persian. That's not even, as it makes its little ugly duckling drafts from the Persian all the way to what we're reading here today. Those are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of drafts. So it was difficult to do for that reason, and I don't really know. It's a mystery to me why I have been so dedicated to him, even though there were so many obstacles for me to do this project, and it's been an uphill battle. But I am a completely transformed human being because of doing these. Not only are some of the greatest poems that I've ever read, now I feel like literally in my bloodstream. But to be in the presence of such a figure who was basically so committed to poetry for the people, poetry for social responsibility, a social and linguistic responsibility as an artist, is a great honor of my life. So I've endured as he endured in bringing his poetry to you. I don't know, I've brought a 6-minute clip of a longer documentary in which he speaks. This is at the end of his life. He's already had a leg amputated due to diabetes, and he's very old. He's maybe a couple years before he passes away. I don't know if we have time. Would you like to watch 6 minutes? Or we can just watch 2 or 3 minutes of it and we can stop it. I don't know what kind of timing we have. Yes, so let's play a few minutes of this wonderful documentary. And before, his third wife, who is still alive, Ida, I call her his wife, muse, assistant, and steward. She was his everything. She basically enabled his work, and it continues to enable his work after his death. And so her name is Ida. He has 2 volumes dedicated to her and many, many, many poems. And they had a very mythic encounter and love affair. So that's who you will see in the documentary with him.
آن که هدفش تنها و تنها رستگاری انسان نباشد، درد و درمان توده ها را نداند و نشناسد، روشنفکر نیست، دزدی است که با چراغ اومده.
خب همه به شما به عنوان یک شاعر اجتماعی نگاه میکنن. این شکل الهامی که شما میگین، خب این به جای خودش محفوظ یک واقعیتی رو داریم برای ما تعریف میکنیم، ولی شعر شما خیلی اجتماعیه.
خب به هر حال تجربه اجتماعی اون که گفتگو نداره، به هر حال تجربه اجتماعیه، ولی اینکه این تجربه اجتماعی چطور تبدیل میشه به یک موضوع شعری و به صورت یک شعر عرضه میشه، خب این برای خود منم مسئله است.
بر کدام جنازه زار میزند این ساز، بر جنازه کدام مرده پنهان میگرید این ساز بی زمان، در کدام غار بر کدام تاریخ میموید این سیم و پنجه نادان، بگذار برخیزد مردم بی لبخند، بگذار برخیزد، زاری در باغچه بس تلخ است، زاری بر چشمه صافی، زاری بر لقاح شکوفه بس تلخ است، زاری بر شراع بلند نسیم، زاری بر سپیدار سبز بالا بس تلخ است، بر برکه لاجوردین ماهی و باد چه می کند این مدیح گوی تباهی؟ مطرب گور خانه به شهرندر چه می کند زیر دریچه های بیگناهی؟ بگذار برخیزد مردم بی لبخند، بگذار برخیزد.
به عنوان کریتیک اجتماعی خب یه جایی این چیز رو به من، این اسم رو بر میگذاشتن، ولی کریتیک اجتماعی که نتونه دهن باز کنه چجور کریتیک اجتماعی، چجور منتقد اجتماعی هست دیگه. همه چیزمون باید به همدیگه یه دست باشه.
با این همه ای قلب در به در از یاد مبر که ما من و تو عشق را رعایت کرده ایم. از یاد مبر که ما من و تو انسان را رعایت کرده ایم. خود اگر شاهکار خدا بود یا نبود.
جالبی قضیه همینه که میگی مثلا چاپ بشه نشه ولی با همین حال پیگیر کار میکنین.
پیگیری نیست، بوز کلفتیه. لغت چه عوضی بکاریم به بوستم کلفته و از رو نمیرم.
شاملو شعرش خودشه، یعنی زندگی شاملو رو نمیشه گفت زندگی شاملو و شعر شاملو، این دوتا یکی. حتی شاملو تو عاشقانه ترین شعراش باز اجتماعی ترین شعراش.
عشق رازی است، لبخند رازی است، عشق رازی است. اشک آن شب لبخند عشقم بود. قصه نیستم که بگویی، نغمه نیستم که بخوانی، صدا نیستم که بشنوی یا چیزی چنان.
I don't know actually. I have to go back. It's obviously one that I haven't translated, but I don't know its title.
That poem, you sound like Neruda in that poem. It's like had that weird, surreal, amazing surrealistic image in there of the turquoise lake and the. That was amazing.
Yes, and you have to consider that these subtitles are not done necessarily by people who translate poetry. So that's a testament to the poem that it comes through in a variety of renditions.
So maybe I'll ask one more question. I mean, I have 4 million questions, but maybe I'll ask one more, and then all people in the audience maybe have questions.
Yeah, and then I would love to read you one last poem,
yeah.
his last poem.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you to read that poem. That's great.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Minds work alike.
Would you like to go first? Yeah.
Well, yeah, just a quick question. Actually, no. Can you read first, and then because I think it'd be better to. I was just going to say while you're looking for it, I was looking for the poet Armand Davudi, and I didn't know if he was here or not, but he's like Shamlou's wife. He's Iranian, but Armenian, Iranian. You know,
Shamlou's wife was Armenian, Iranian
right, I know.
as well.
That's like my friend Armand Davudi is also.
Oh yeah, I know Armand. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. We have an event together next month.
Okay. Goes well.
Great.
Yeah, I'd love to hear the last poem. So the final poem in the book is
Jagged and Endless.
Yes.
But I wonder whether I should do 2 poems. Well, anyway, yeah. I would really love to read you Written in Dawn's Blood, in which, you know, his pseudonym was Dawn. Aleph Bamdad, which is A, dawn or daybreak. Or sometimes he just went by Bamdad, and he addresses himself in the third person in a few of his poems. So if you get the book, I really urge you to read Written in Dawn's Blood, but I want to leave room for you to ask questions. So I'll only read his very last poem, which he wrote only a few months before he died on July 23rd, I think, 2000, July 23rd. I always forget 22nd, 23rd. I have to do the math between the 12-hour time difference. So, okay. Jagged and Endless. Jagged and endless, spanning times past and yet to come. Skeletal columns, hollow sockets, bare ribs, a mouth swallowing its cry, teeth caved in, off-key whistles linger in the ancient wind, echoing lost days of antiquity. Ancient winds through clean-swept skulls on endless limestone columns buried in the sands of primal longing. Blank notebooks of innocence in a wooden tub balanced on the head, waiting at the gate of passage. A grimy thread at the eye of a darning needle. But your presence still surrounded my bed, perfect and whole, before sleep pulled me into its deepest depths. I thought, this is the meaning of life. So don't take the midday rest for granted. That's when I knew death is not the end.
It's quite a way to go out. It's a great last line, final line. I think actually, let's just move to audience questions.
If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you. Okay.
My wife does a lot of Q&As, and she always says the same thing. She says, question is something that has a question mark on the end. So let's ask questions of Niloufar.
You said he read a lot of world poetry. Who was his major influence, if any? And
Paul Éluard.
That's
I
amazing.
write about that in the introduction as well. He read the Surrealists, and they had littérature, the notion of littérature engagée, and which for him became, that's like engaged literature, engaged arts, meaning socially responsible arts. And so he had his own, in Persian, he would call it ta'ahud. Ta'ahud is a commitment to social and artistic and linguistic responsibility. So those innovations in imagery and in modernism, basically, really very early on influenced him. And Éluard has I translated a part, not me, I think Samuel Beckett. I did the Samuel Beckett translation. Éluard has a very famous poem that was dropped from airplanes during World War II when people were desperate in France. And that poem really, I think, to me, as I translated Shamlou's poems, really influenced many of his poems, including the very first one that we read, Common Love, just the repetitions and all that. I'm going to read you just a couple lines from the Éluard poem. It's called Liberté, freedom, which is basically, Shamlou is known as the master poet of liberty in Iran. His sole raison d'être was the pursuit of freedom. So the Éluard poem in translation, in Samuel Beckett's translation, is, on my school notebooks, on my desk and on the trees, on the sand, on the snow, I write your name. And by the power of a word, I begin my life again. I was born to know you, to name you, liberty. It's Éluard, yeah. And when you read a few of Shamlou's poems, it's a direct influence from this. So then he went on to read, Russian poets. He was very, very influenced by what was happening in the Soviet Union, Marxism, all of that ideology, and the fact that what was the function of art for the people, and how it was being dictated in the Soviet Union by the powers that be on what its role was, very nationalist role. And then he just really read haikus. He went all over the world. He read Greek poetry, all kinds of poetry, and he also translated prose. So yeah, those were his main influences. But I see a lot of Éluard, and I put that in there a few times. So you'll be able to cross-reference it.
Well, it makes sense that it makes perfect sense that he would be influenced by the Surrealists, because the Surrealists believed that the way to heal ourselves as human beings was through the imagination. It was not through, necessarily lecturing each other about how we should behave, but it was about the reuniting of the imagination and the sort of, everyday self. So it's a poetry that, in a way, transcends the particularities of situations.
Well,
often.
thank you for mentioning that, because, and Shamlou always thought that human beings, we are by the use of our imagination and our humanity, reconnecting with it, in charge of our own liberation, that it's in our powers, in our own hands. It's that close and that palpable. And that speaks to what we're going through today, that, you know, we are, whether you know it or not, in a struggle for liberation at this point in history. Here.
And that's why, I mean, poems, far more than, you know, what particular message they might have, are the act of reading a poem and engaging your imagination and being in community is of self a resistance. I'm guessing that's one of the reasons why, you know, this evening is titled the way it is, because just to simply read is a kind of resistance, and to imagine and to begin to liberate oneself, or to continually liberate oneself.
And to think.
Yes, and to think, but you can do it. You have help doing it. You know, you have help. You can read some of these poems, and that can help you reactivate your mind. Anyway, I don't want to take up the audience's time, but
I am so inspired by your presentation and your work and incredible translations. Thank you. So my question is kind of technical. You know, I know with poetry, word choice is important. I see that you were faithful to his alliteration, his, you know, the repetition. How many different versions did you have? Because there's, you know, there's the sounds, right? The sounds of the language are so much a part of the poetry. I didn't have to know the language to be affected by his voice. So how many versions did you have to do when you were translating to feel like you were getting the spirit of his poetry?
I wasn't always faithful to his alliterations and all that. And just because I sort of took his own approach to translation, not fully, because he would rewrite everything. And he would say so. He would say, I feel like this Kafka would be better this way. So I sort of took his, general route. I don't know how to count versions for you because it's years, decades, and it's, I would say in the hundreds, and sometimes it's, I fortunately found a very organized way to work with my collaborators, the wonderful people who helped me travel these poems from one language to the other. And so I would say hundreds and hundreds. And Matthew, you would know, in Matway will probably tell you, my publisher, my wonderful publisher, World Poetry Books, that, when it gets to the much later stages, you're just proofreading, you're not really changing things. I was changing things until the last minute. I was trying to keep it to a minimum, but
yes,
ideally, but oh my gosh, so I'm very happy with what's in here now, only because Matway was generous enough to just let me make some last minute
used
changes.
to it. He's been a publisher and a poet for a long time, so he probably was not. He probably understood your commitment.
I hope so.
And again, you felt like you had a lot of responsibility, I think, to Shamlou, so it wasn't just, tinkering for the sake of tinkering.
Yeah, he was very, very mindful, because the final manuscript was due in October of last year. I asked him, I said, I've gotten to a point where the language was still like mid 20th century English, which is contemporary of, what Shamlou was doing in Persian. And so that's sort of how I would hear, this is when I talk about the flight of these languages from one to the other, there's many stops. It sort of starts leaving Persian and it has to arrive into native English. And it was sort of like 20th century English poetry. And I asked Matway, I said, can you just give me 2 more months? It'll be much better. And he said, he gave me 2 more months. And then it was like 2 more weeks. And then, and then he had it for a long time, and he had it all summer. I was supposed to get it at the beginning of summer. So the last few months have been incredibly harrowing and stressful to get them to the point which they are now. And I'm very, very happy with how we managed that.
The person we're talking about is Matvey Yankelevich, who's the editor of Ugly Duckling Press, which is a kind of long time independent press out of Brooklyn, and they've done an enormous number of translations and also experimental poetry. They're like a kind of central
Yes,
force in independent poetry over the past 20, 25 years. And
absolutely. I
he's
can't believe the list he's building.
He's also a poet. So yeah, Madve.
And a translator.
And a translator.
Yeah.
That's the Madve we're talking about. So
Yeah.
Other questions? Or yeah, thank you for that question. That was a great question. Thank you.
You talk about how you had like a personal relationship with him before he had passed, how you had welcomed him, you know, into your parents' home, and how you had been on tour with him, and obviously had quite a personal relationship with him, and then had to really ingest and have these poems be a part of you and your research in the last few decades after he had passed. How did your dynamic, or how did your perception of him both as like a person and a poet change after his passing and after really studying his work instead of just knowing him?
Oh my God, I'm so glad you asked that. That was
It's a loaded question. Well, I didn't welcome him into our home. I was just a 11, 12-year-old. My parents did, and then I joined him on the UCLA and UC Berkeley tours. So, and those were pivotal years for me. I was, very young, just in college, and I was sort of becoming a writer myself. And so he had, apart from these times when I was on, I followed him to his lectures and would visit him where he was staying. He had somebody drive him 2 hours to where I was living at the time, which is Laguna Beach in Southern California. And I wrote about that in my memoir, about that encounter where he just came because he had heard that Niloufar is going through a kind of, she's breaking out of a chrysalis. She's becoming a writer. And so he came to see me. I don't even remember what we talked about, really. I have fragments of what I remember, but that's the kind of sort of kindness that he showed to me as well. But at the same time, he told me some things that it took me 20, 25, 30 years to then, in my estimation, think that this was a little bit of a man-centered, male-centered comment. Like he said to me, "Oh, you remind me of Margarita from The Master and Margarita." And I was 22, 23, and I didn't know what he meant. So I went and checked it out at the library, and I didn't really like the book, so I didn't read it. It's a long book, as you know, as you may know. So I didn't really read it, so I didn't really understand who Margarita was. And then when I was writing my memoir / his literary biography, I read it. And I was disgusted by the depiction, sort of very patriarchal depiction of, this enabler who is naked in Satan's ball, and she lives to enable her poet husband, and she gives up her life to all, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, did you say I reminded you of Margarita? I mean, I am not a female enabler of a male poet. I am the male poet. Or I am the artist, So I do write about that. Thank you. I do write about that. So there's a de-idolization of somebody who means so much to me. So it's a very loaded question, and I appreciate you asking that. And the introduction starts with.
So I think we have time for one more question. Is there someone on this side of the room who had a question?
Hi, thank you so much for your poetry, for your translations. With respect to Genesis, I was sort of curious about whether or not you saw anything Zoroastrian in the images of Eve and how she becomes impregnated and how nature makes that entrance into the poem. I was kind of struck by how sort of offstage Adam is, or maybe I didn't see him. Yeah, in there.
He's
But
not there.
Yeah, I was wondering if just Zoroastrianism, as I understand, leans very much into nature. It's the religion before Islam, and I'm
Yeah,
wondering.
I've done a couple of projects about Zoroastrianism.
Yes, you know so much more. And I'm wondering if that was part of maybe the transgressing that he's doing in Genesis in terms of reimagining a biblical text, but in the context of a very ancient religion in Iran.
I would just call it pagan, not Zoroastrian. I would call it pagan, even preceding Zoroastrianism, because that would be a very specific set of imagery and metaphors. And there's no mention of that. Fire, in the Zoroastrian sense, there's no mention of somebody in white. There's none of that. It's very, very pagan. It's extremely primal to me. So I would call it that rather than Zoroastrian. And especially knowing that he would not really make that, he wouldn't commit himself to a particular institutionalized religion, which is what Zoroastrianism is as well.
Well, I feel like we've learned a lot, and there's a lot more to learn. And so I hope that you'll all go back to the back, buy a copy of this book, get Niloufar to sign it. It's a treasure, and you can be among the first people who have it, and then you can lord it over other people who weren't lucky enough to be here tonight. So thank you to the library, thank you to Litquake, thank you to the booksellers, and most of all, thank you to Niloufar. Let's give her a big round of applause, please. Thank you so much. And you'll sign books.
Thank you, Matthew. And Matthew's book is here as well. I don't know which one, but one of your many books is here as well. So we'll both
Love
be doing
listening to your
a
dreams.
signing.
Yes, so please do visit the bookseller in the back, and if you have your surveys, please fill those out with pencils on your seat and hand them to our volunteer, Enrique, who's standing by the exits. Thank you, audience, for coming. We hope you come back. There's still another dozen Litquake events and events every day at the library. Thank you, Matthew Zapruder and Niloufar Talebi.